Hello everyone, bringing you a video today talking about this. Now this is an example of the British issue Middle Parka, the third pattern, which has a detachable hood. We'll be talking about all the features and so forth in just a moment. I wanted to give a little bit of a preamble here. This actually belonged to a friend of mine, John McIntyre, who unfortunately passed away recently after a battle with cancer. Before he passed away, he had given me some of his uniforms and other bits and pieces from his military service, including his blues uniform, which we may well have a look at in a future video. And since his passing, his widow has passed more of his kit and uniform and so forth that was still in the house. She's passed that on to me as well. And in amongst that kit was this. John had quite an interesting military career. He joined the British Army in the 1970s and served, I believe, right the way through the 1990s, left with the rank of Major in the Royal Signals. Served in Northern Ireland, in Cyprus, and also with the Commonwealth Monitoring Force in Rhodesia, which is quite interesting. Not a particularly large force that, and it was interesting to know someone who served out there, and his blues uniform includes the Rhodesia Medal ribbon. So we may have a look at some of the other bits and pieces going forward. I did already have examples of the Middle Parka, but this is a particularly nice example, and receiving this sort of prompted me to make the video. And as I say, this was John's. His name is written into it. I don't know how he came across this, whether he was issued it or whether he acquired it, private purchase to use later on. They were manufactured into the 1970s and certainly issued into the 1970s, so it's quite possible he was actually issued this. It doesn't seem to have seen much use. It's in very clean, tidy condition, so it's possible it was issued and then not used all that much. It would have been a bit big on John, as we'll see from the sizing. John was about my size, about 5'10", very slim if you look at his blues uniform, which we'll possibly have a look at in a follow-up video at some point, but this would have swamped him. Typical army issuing from that point of view, I would say, if it was issued. As I say, we'll have a look at the labels and so forth, which give you the size details a little bit later on. So we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. I'm keen to talk about this example because it is in very nice condition, and I'm sure John would have been happy to know that some of his kit was being sort of used for this sort of purpose. He was quite interested in what I was doing with the channel and everything else. So this, as I say, is an example of the third pattern of the Middle Parka. That is to say, it's an example made of sateen material, has top pockets and a detachable hood, which are all the features which were sort of finalised in the third pattern. Produced in 1953 and then through until the 1970s. So this was the final design of the Middle Parka. Talking about the details, the features of this in more detail, we have here at the top a hood, which we'll get more detail of as we move this around. We'll see more of the details of this. But you can see this has a metal wired cowl around the front here. You can fasten this up around the chin as well. There is a hook on this side, if I can find it, up here. You see a metal hook there, and then a loop of cloth up here, so that can be hooked around there to really close the hood up around the face. Obviously this is designed for extreme cold weather use, so those features obviously are designed to keep as much cold air and the wind and so forth off the face as possible and off the head. It's lined with a faux pile, which we'll see more detail of when we turn this inside out, and as I say, you have this very large cowl which can be moulded. We'll see more detail of that as we look at this side on in a minute. It buttons onto the parka. It's removable, as said. On the outside it buttons on with these large buttons. It buttons onto the epaulets as well. We'll see that as we move it round. And then it also has a series of buttons on the inside which button it into the inner collar as well. And we'll see more detail of that in just a minute too. The parka itself is a very heavily padded garment, heavily insulated. You can see down the front here it closes with a button flap over a heavy duty zip which runs all the way down the middle here, and that final button at the top would button across to this button here to close right up to the collar. I've left this open to illustrate the zip. You can see this has a cloth pull with a wooden toggle, and these are used elsewhere on the parka as well, and it's a heavy duty black and brass zip there, as you can see, and this runs all the way down the centre line. Two breast pockets here. These weren't present on the initial design of this parka, the first pattern. The second pattern introduced these, but the parka was made in gabardine and had a fixed hood. And then in the third pattern, we have it now made in sateen and the hood removable. The pockets are just simple patch pockets with a large flap there, as you can see. Large buttons throughout to make it a little bit easier to get in and out of these with gloves. And as you can see there, the flap actually folds over the top of the pocket to give some extra weatherproofing and obviously prevent items from falling out of there. These are not a mirror image across the front here. This one includes an extra little pocket here, and this is for a quartz fibre dosimeter, which could be worn in there, obviously to give a personal dosimeter reading if operating in contaminated, in radiologically contaminated areas. And then you have these large pockets down at the bottom here, 2 lower hip pockets there, again with a large flap, large buttons throughout, and again the flap, as you can see there, folds over to give some extra weatherproofing to the pocket there. Another thing to talk about at the front here, you can see we have 2 buttons here. These 2 buttons allow for a flap to be buttoned up through the crotch, through the rise, a feature taken across from airborne clothing. It was also part of the design of the combat smock introduced alongside this, and that buttons up to these 2 buttons, and we'll see that when we turn this inside out. So remember these 2 buttons here, that's what the tail is supposed to button onto if it's used. So that's the front of the Parka here. Obviously we'll start turning this around now and have a look at some of the other details, and eventually we'll turn this inside out as well, have a look at the internal details and the labels and so forth. Moving on to look at the right hand side of this, if we lift the hood up here, this may actually stay in position on its own, it will. We have the hook, which we talked about previously, which allows that flap to be hooked up around the chin. We have the cowl here, which is reinforced with stitching, as you can see, and the wire coming around here, which allows that to be moulded in place. And then we have a draw cord which draws in the front of the hood here, and you can see if I pull that tight here the effect that has drawing this in here. That has a simple wooden stop which is a friction fit on the cord for pulling this tight and tightening it off, so that just slides up and down on there with a friction fit to secure the draw cord. The way the hood attaches can be seen here. There is a single button which buttons from the Parka onto the hood here, a single small button. The rest of the buttons inside the collar we'll see later on, they actually on the hood button through the collar and then back through the hood to attach it internally. We'll see that in just a minute when we turn this inside out. But outside we have this large flap on the hood here which buttons on to this button at the front, which we've already seen, and then onto the epaulette button here, and the epaulette then buttons over the top of that, as you can see there. We'll see more detail of how this attaches when we move it round and look at the back as well. Just fold that down out of the way again. Looking at the arm here, we can see how the epaulette attaches here on the shoulder there. We have an elbow reinforcement piece which runs all the way around the arm there, as you can see. You see the stitching for that there. And then the cuff can be adjusted in using this system here. There is a strap running through a channel which is stitched on there. You can see the stitching each side here, and you can see the openings of the channel here and here. And this strap can be adjusted in very easily, again made easy to manipulate when wearing gloves, by having a loop here which you can hook your thumb through and then just pull on the strap, and the strap is stitched over at the end there to give you something to grip, and that allows you to draw the cuff in with a metal buckle there securing the strap around the cuff. And of course this is to allow for a layer of air to be trapped against the body. It keeps another layer of air inside this within the pile, and that's of course the best way of achieving, the best design for cold weather clothing is clothing which traps air underneath a layer of warm air and obviously stops it escaping, and that's part of the design, is having this strap around the wrist there to tighten the cuff in. So that's the right hand side. We'll move this around now and have a look at the back. Looking at the back here, if we lift the hood out of the way, you can see the flap running round the base of the hood here, and it attaches onto the other epaulette round this side here. I won't show you the left hand side because it is just a mirror image of this side. There's nothing more to see on that side really. But looking at the back here, we can see further draw cord on the back of the hood, which can be used to draw the back of the hood in. You can pull down on these 2 here, and the draw cord actually runs up through this channel here and draws that in. You can see me pulling the other one through there. But we do have that draw cord at the rear as well. Just open that up again. There we go. The back of the Parka is very plain. You can see the stitched in channel for the waist draw cord here. It has a fishtail, as was colloquially referred to, so the back is considerably longer than the front. You can actually see the tail I mentioned before, which can be buttoned through to the front, similar to airborne, that found on airborne clothing, and you can see that there. We'll see more detail of that when we turn this inside out. The back of the Parka otherwise pretty plain. And the next thing to do with this is to turn it inside out, have a look at the internal lining, the pile lining to this, and the other internal features which can be seen, and we'll have a look at the labels as well. So we'll have a look at the inside of this now, and we have the front of the inside of the Parka here. The first thing to talk about is the lining material. This is a faux pile, which again is designed to trap that layer of air underneath the garment and stop it from escaping. This is a fixed liner. It is not removable from the Parka, in contrast to some other designs of the time. So you do have this fixed lining material which is stitched in to the parka itself. At the waist here we have a draw cord. You can see each end of that here. We saw the channel for that when we were looking at the back. And then we have an instruction label down here stitched in. We'll have a look at this in some detail now. Obviously you can pause should you wish to read this, but it does give instructions about wearing the garment and obviously the use of the various different features. So we'll pause on that now and you can read that should you wish to. There's not really much to show you in terms of the hood from this angle, so we'll start moving this round and we'll have a look at some of the details of the hood, looking at it from the side. Looking at the side profile here, we can see details of the hood. If we lift this up here, you can see the pile lining, which lines the entirety of the hood back from the cowl, as you can see there. You can also see how the hood attaches. So this is a relatively complex way of doing things, but it does work. We have a flap of cloth on the hood, which buttons over this button, which buttons through the collar of the parka. So if I unbutton this, you can perhaps see we have the collar of the parka there with a buttonhole in it and a button attached to the hood, which goes through that buttonhole. And then there's also this flap of cloth on the hood, which again buttons over that button, so that you have the button passing through the parka and then through the hood again to secure the hood. So you can see that there. Gives some extra windproofing at the actual join where the collar buttons onto the hood. So you have a series of these buttons all the way around, as we'll see. There is one additional button on this side on the parka itself, which finally buttons through a single buttonhole on the hood, but the rest of them, the buttons are all attached to the hood, button through the collar and then back through the hood in order to attach it. I hope I've explained that clearly enough. We will also have a look at the hood detached from the parka just to show you the detail of how that works as well. Here we have an example of the hood removed from the parka, and the main point I want to illustrate here is how this attaches. So you can see here a little bit more detail of the lining material here. We actually have two different colours of lining material. Doesn't matter, of course, it does the same job. Unfortunately, the label from this has been damaged at some point in its life. This example has the vegetable ivory buttons you can see here, just in contrast with the green ones we saw on the hood that's actually attached to the parka. And these buttons button through the collar of the parka, as mentioned, and then this flap buttons on top of them. So you can see that this whole series of buttons here is attached to the hood. There's then a final buttonhole here, which just buttons through a single button, a single small button attached to the parka. The rest of them, the buttons are all attached to the hood, and then that buttons both through the collar of the parka and then through this flap. So hopefully that clearly shows how the hood attaches. The final thing to talk about looking at the side here is the cuff design. What we have here is the pile lining actually carries on all the way down to the edge of the cuff here, the very end of the cuff, where you have this section double back on itself, obviously just to finish off the hem of the cuff there. Inside you have this section of cloth with a knitted cuff stitched on the end of it, and obviously this again is to trap that layer of air, stop it escaping at the cuff, and obviously the strap tightens down on the outside of this to pull that in around the arm as well to trap that layer of air. So you have that knitted cuff within, as you can see underneath there, the pile lining continues all the way down. So detail of the cuff there, as you can see. Looking at the back here, you can see various details. We have both the label in the hood here, which we'll have a look at in detail now. You can see this reads hoods attachable for parkas middle, and then we actually have a NATO stock number there and the size large, which actually states that this is for sizes 3, 6 and 8. You really need an extra large for this size of parka. As we'll see, this is a very large size of parka, but this one does seem to work, and it's the one that came with it. And you can see it does have John's name, McIntyre, written in at the bottom there. The contract number would suggest this is 60s or early 70s manufacture. And as I say, these were issued until around that time period, until the 1970s. So this is quite a late production example. Continuing to talk about the parka itself, we have a hanging tab sewn in here, on this little piece of cloth at the back here. And then beneath that we have the label, and again we'll get a close-up of this, have a look at the details on the label here. Looking at the label in more detail here, you can again see John's written his last name in here, McIntyre. But underneath that you can see Parka's middle without hood, which was the designation for these in the 1950s. And you have size 9, which gives the height as 5'11" to 6'2", breast 43 to 46, and then you have the manufacturer there, Inverter Coke Company Limited of Newton Abbot, and the date of manufacture of 1954. Moving down, we can see further details here. We have the tail I mentioned previously, which buttons up inside out of the way when not in use. You can see that here. We just have these buttons sewn into the inside to secure that when it's not in use. And John has again written his last name into the tail here, McIntyre, as you can see there. And then the liner itself is actually loose at the bottom here. You can see that there, and buttons in, so the liner can be drawn up out of the way of the tail if required. You can see that there. You can actually see detail of the inside of the lining material here. You can see the back of that. And the bottom of this is obviously edged with a piece of cloth to finish that off, finish off the hem of the lining material there. You have these buttons on each side, which allow you to button the liner in at the tail there, as you can see. If I lift this up, hopefully you can clearly see there of the buttons on each side. It's quite a bulky garment to look at this, as I say, so hopefully that's clear enough in shot there. So that's the back of the parka. We won't have a look at the left-hand side. It's basically a mirror image of what we've seen here. As I say, you've got the various details there of how the hood attaches, the various internal features, and that's the inside of the parka and the hood. So hopefully you found it interesting looking at this. I certainly find it an interesting garment. Hopefully it's been clear enough looking at the various features on this. On the mannequin, it's quite a large, bulky garment on a relatively small mannequin, so hopefully it's been clear enough to see what we're talking about here. If you have found this interesting and you'd like to see more from the channel, please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you would like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And as ever, a huge thank you to everybody who supports the channel using those two methods. It really is greatly appreciated. Thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And if you'd like to get in touch but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address down below as well. That's everything for this video, so until next time, bye for now.